You know the story of the Titanic. Everyone does. But what if I told you there was another ship, even larger than Titanic, that also sank during World War I? And this time, there were nurses aboard. Real nurses, caring for wounded soldiers in the middle of a war zone. I'm going to tell you what it was like to be on that ship. To serve aboard His Majesty's Hospital Ship Britannic on November 21st, 1916. The day she went down in just 55 minutes. This is the story most people have never heard. Let me take you back to 1916. The world is deep into the Great War. The Western Front is a nightmare of trenches, mud, and constant death. And me? I'm Violet Jessop, a 29-year-old stewardess who's seen more than most people twice my age. Actually, let's pause there for a second because this gets wild. I wasn't just on the Britannic when she sank. I was also aboard the Titanic in 1912 when she went down. And before that, I was on the Olympic when she collided with HMS Hawke in 1911. Three sister ships, three disasters, one very unlucky, or perhaps very lucky, woman. But we'll get to that. The Britannic wasn't supposed to be a hospital ship. When they laid her keel in 1911, she was meant to be the third and final luxury liner in the White Star Line's Olympic-class series, the biggest, most advanced passenger ship ever built. Then the Titanic happened. After that disaster, they went back to the drawing board. Double hull along most of the length. Lifeboats for everyone, not just first class. Watertight compartments that actually went high enough to matter. They learned their lessons, or so they thought. But by the time she was ready to launch in 1914, the world had changed. World War I had begun, and Britain needed hospital ships more than luxury liners, so the Britannic never carried a single paying passenger. Instead, she was painted white with a green stripe and massive red crosses on her hull. She became a floating hospital. Now, the Britannic wasn't just any hospital ship. She was magnificent, even in wartime configuration. Picture this. A vessel 882 feet long, nearly 3 football fields. She could carry over 3,300 people, including up to 3,000 wounded soldiers at a time. The grand staircase was still there, though now it led to wards instead of dining rooms. The Turkish baths became storage. The swimming pool was drained. But she was still beautiful in her own way. The medical facilities were state-of-the-art for 1916. Operating theaters with the latest equipment, wards with hundreds of beds, X-ray machines, which were cutting-edge technology back then, pharmacies stocked with morphine, bandages, antiseptics, everything you'd need to save lives at sea. I joined the Britannic's crew as part of the Voluntary Aid Detachment, the VAD. We weren't fully trained nurses, most of us, but we'd learned enough to help. Changing dressings, feeding patients, keeping them comfortable during the long voyage back to Britain. The fully qualified nursing sisters ran the medical operations. We did everything else. Here's what a typical voyage looked like. We'd depart from Southampton or Liverpool, sail through the Mediterranean to the Greek islands, particularly Mudros on the island of Lemnos. That's where the hospital ships picked up wounded from the Gallipoli campaign and later from the Macedonian front. The journey out was always strange. Empty beds waiting. The ship quiet except for the crew. We'd prepare the wards, check supplies, review procedures, knowing that, on the way back, those beds would be full of broken men. Young men, most of them. Boys, really. 18, 19, 20 years old. Gas burns, shrapnel wounds, missing limbs, trench foot, shell shock. The war was grinding up an entire generation. Our job was to patch them back together. The voyage back to Britain was never quiet. Even with morphine, even with the best care we could provide, you could hear the moaning at night. Some men called for their mothers. Some screamed from nightmares. Some just stared at the ceiling, hollow-eyed, somewhere far away from the ship. We did what we could. Held hands, changed dressings, wrote letters home for men who couldn't hold a pen anymore. Small mercies in a brutal war. By November 1916, I'd made several trips on the Britannic. I knew the ship well. I knew the crew. I'd settled into the rhythm of wartime sailing. That's when you get comfortable. That's when things go wrong. On November 12th, we departed Southampton on what should have been a routine voyage. The Britannic was under the command of Captain Charles Bartlett, an experienced seaman. We had a full crew, plenty of supplies, and the ship was in excellent condition. We sailed down through the Bay of Biscay, through the Strait of Gibraltar, into the Mediterranean. The weather was good. No U-boat sightings, no problems at all. We reached the Key Channel, between the Greek mainland and the island of Kea, on the morning of November 21st. We were supposed to arrive at Mudros later that day to pick up wounded soldiers. It was a beautiful morning, clear sky, calm sea. The kind of day that makes you forget there's a war on. I was in my cabin, finishing breakfast. The time was 8:12 a.m. That's when I felt it. Not a crash. Not a bang. More like a shudder that ran through the entire ship. Like the Britannic had hit something, but softly. Almost gently. My tea spilled across the table. For a moment, everything was silent. Then the alarm started. I'd heard those alarms before. 4 years earlier, on a cold April night in the North Atlantic. But I pushed that thought away and focused on what I needed to do. Get to my station. Follow the drill. Help where I'm needed. I grabbed my coat and rushed into the corridor. Other stewardesses and nurses were emerging from their cabins, confused, asking what happened. Nobody knew yet. But we all headed for our emergency stations. The ship was listing. I could feel it. Not badly yet, but definitely tilting to starboard toward the right side of the ship. That wasn't good. Here's what we didn't know at the time, but learned later. The Britannic had struck a mine. A German mine laid by the submarine U-73 weeks earlier. The mine had exploded against the starboard bow, between the forecastle and the bridge, right where the ship's design was supposed to protect her. Remember those improvements after Titanic? The better watertight compartments? They should have worked. The Britannic should have been able to stay afloat even with the first 5 or 6 compartments flooded. The designers had planned for exactly this type of damage, but there was a problem nobody had anticipated. It was 8:12 in the morning. The ship was preparing to arrive at port. Many of the portholes in the lower decks were open, letting in fresh air. When the mine exploded and the ship began to list, water started pouring in through those open portholes. The watertight compartments didn't matter if the water could just flow in through holes in the side of the ship. The Britannic was flooding fast, much faster than anyone expected. Captain Bartlett initially tried to beach the ship. Kea was close, maybe 2.5 miles away. If he could run the Britannic aground in shallow water, most people could wade ashore. It was a good plan. It should have worked. But the flooding was causing the bow to sink lower in the water. And here's where things went from bad to catastrophic. Someone, and we never learned who, opened the watertight doors on the lower decks. Maybe trying to help, maybe panicking, maybe following an order we didn't know about. It didn't matter. The water spread faster. Captain Bartlett made a decision. He ordered full speed ahead, trying to reach the shore before the ship sank. But moving forward at full speed when your bow is already underwater is like trying to drive a car with a flat tire at 100 miles per hour. Water crashed over the forward decks. The bow went down further. And then, it happened. The still spinning propellers on the port side rose out of the water as the stern lifted. They were massive, powerful, deadly pieces of machinery. And 2 lifeboats full of people, already launched and trying to row away from the ship, drifted into their path. The propellers chewed through those lifeboats like tissue paper. 30 people died. Most of the total casualties from the Britannic disaster. Killed not by the mine, not by drowning, but by the ship's own propellers. When reports of this reached the bridge, Captain Bartlett immediately ordered the engines stopped. But by then, the beach plan was finished. The Britannic was going down. Up on deck, it was organized chaos. The crew was professional, I'll give them that. We'd drilled for this. Everyone knew their jobs. But drills are different when the ship isn't actually sinking beneath your feet. The list to starboard was getting worse. Walking across the deck felt like climbing a hill. Equipment that wasn't secured was sliding toward the railing. You had to watch your footing constantly. Lifeboats were being lowered. This time, there were more than enough. After Titanic, that was one thing they'd made absolutely sure of. The Britannic carried 55 lifeboats and rafts with capacity for over 3,600 people. We only had about 1,100 people aboard that day. No patients, thankfully, since we were sailing out empty. Just crew and medical staff. Still, launching lifeboats on a listing ship in the middle of the Key Channel wasn't simple. I helped load women and crew into one of the boats. Keep calm, move quickly, don't panic. That was the mantra. Some of the younger VAD nurses were terrified. I couldn't blame them. But panic gets people killed, so I kept my voice steady. It's all right. We've got plenty of boats. Everyone's getting off. Nice and orderly. Was I scared? Of course I was scared. But I'd been through this before. I knew that if you kept your head, followed procedures, and got into a lifeboat, you had a very good chance of surviving. The sea was calm. The weather was clear. Help would come quickly. This wasn't the North Atlantic in the middle of the night with water cold enough to kill you in 15 minutes. This was survivable. My lifeboat was loaded. We were lowered toward the water. The descent was rough, the tackle creaking, the boat swaying. But we made it to the surface and pushed away from the Britannic's hull. That's when I got my first real look at what was happening. The Britannic was dying. The bow was completely underwater. The forward well deck had disappeared beneath the waves. Water was pouring into every opening, every porthole, every ventilation shaft. The ship was tilting more and more, the starboard side dipping toward the sea. And she was sinking fast. Incredibly fast. From the mine strike at 8:12 to the moment I was in the lifeboat, maybe 20 minutes had passed. The ship was already in her death throes. Other lifeboats were in the water around us, rowing away from the ship. Some had gotten clear easily. Others, the ones that had launched earlier when the captain was still trying to beach her, had encountered those propellers. I could see debris in the water, wreckage from the destroyed lifeboats, and people. Some swimming, some floating, some not moving at all. Our boat pulled toward them, helping where we could, pulling survivors aboard, but some were beyond help. The Britannic's stern was rising out of the water now, exactly like Titanic, except in daylight, faster, and with everyone watching. You could hear the sounds of destruction from inside the ship. Metal tearing, glass shattering, furniture sliding and crashing. Everything that wasn't bolted down was tumbling toward the bow. The engineering spaces were flooding. The boilers were probably underwater by now. People were still on deck, still climbing down ropes and ladders, still jumping into the water. Captain Bartlett was there on the bridge, staying with his ship as captains do. Other officers were ensuring everyone got off. The nurses, the stewardesses, the crew, we all got off. The discipline held. The training worked. At 9:07 a.m., less than an hour after the mine strike, the Britannic's stern rose high into the air. The propellers that had killed so many were now pointing at the sky. The ship hung there for a moment, vertical, like a finger pointing to heaven. Then she slid beneath the waves. The suction pulled debris down with her. The water roiled and churned. Waves spread out from where the massive ship had been. And then there was just the sea, scattered lifeboats, and the wreckage. The Britannic was gone. We floated there for a while, taking stock, checking who was in each boat, calling out for survivors in the water. The sun was bright and warm. The irony wasn't lost on me. beautiful weather, calm sea, and we'd just lost a ship. But here's the remarkable thing. Out of about 1,100 people aboard, only 30 died. Most of those from the propeller strikes, not from the sinking itself. Compare that to Titanic's 1,500 dead out of 2,200 people. The improvements worked. The extra lifeboats worked. The training worked. The calm weather and warm water helped enormously, and not having 2,000 passengers in addition to crew made the evacuation much easier. Still, 30 people were gone. 30 people who woke up that morning expecting a routine day and never saw nightfall. 30 people was 30 too many. Rescue came quickly. We were close to shore, in Greek waters, and distress signals had gone out immediately. Fishing boats arrived first, then British naval vessels. By early afternoon, all survivors were safely ashore on Kia or aboard rescue ships. We were cold, wet, tired, and shaken, but alive. I remember sitting on the deck of a rescue vessel, wrapped in a blanket, drinking tea that tasted better than anything I'd had in my life. Looking back at the water where the Britannic had gone down. 3 ships, I thought. 3 disasters. How does this keep happening to me? But I was alive. Again. And I was grateful. Though I'll admit, I was starting to wonder if maybe, just maybe, I should consider a different line of work. The investigation into the Britannic's sinking started almost immediately. The official inquiry concluded it was a mine strike, not a torpedo. U-73 had laid mines in the Key Channel about 3 weeks earlier. The Britannic just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. But there were questions. Why did she sink so fast when she was supposedly unsinkable? Why were the portholes open? Who opened the watertight doors? Why did Captain Bartlett try to beach her instead of stopping immediately? Some answers came out. Some never did. The open portholes were blamed on crew preparing for arrival at port. The watertight doors were possibly opened by someone trying to access a flooding compartment. Or possibly, they were never fully closed in the first place. The attempt to beach her was a judgment call that might have worked if the flooding had been slower. In the end, it was a combination of factors. The mine strike was bad luck. The flooding was worse than expected. The open portholes turned a survivable incident into a catastrophic one. The attempt to beach her led to the propeller deaths. No single cause, just a cascade of small problems that added up to disaster. Here's what's interesting, though. The Britannic is largely forgotten today. Ask someone about the Titanic and they'll talk for hours. Ask about the Britannic and you'll get blank stares. Why? Partly because she sank during World War I, when there were much bigger tragedies happening every day. The Battle of the Somme earlier that year killed over 300,000 people. The Battle of Verdun killed 300,000 more. A hospital ship sinking with 30 casualties barely made the newspapers, partly because there were no rich and famous people aboard. No Astors, no Guggenheims, no tales of millionaires going down with the ship. Just nurses, sailors, and doctors doing their jobs. Partly because almost everyone survived. Disasters with happy endings don't capture the public imagination the way tragedies do. The Britannic just sank. Most people survived, and the world moved on. But those of us who were there didn't forget. Let me tell you what it was really like, beyond the facts and timeline. It was the smell of the sea mixed with fuel oil leaking from the ship. It was the sound of women praying in the lifeboats, quiet and constant. It was the feeling of the deck tilting under your feet and knowing you were standing on 50,000 tons of steel that was about to become a tomb. It was watching the ship disappear and thinking about all those wards we'd prepared. All those beds that would never hold patients. All the men who would die in field hospitals instead of being brought home aboard the Britannic. It was the young nurse next to me in the lifeboat, barely 20 years old, crying silently. Not for herself, but for the war, for the waste of it all, for the beautiful ship that became another casualty. It was personal items floating in the water afterward. A shoe, a book, a nurse's cap. Small things that meant everything to someone. It was being alive when you should be dead, and feeling guilty about it. After the Britannic, I took some time off. Not long, because the war still needed nurses and crew, but enough to process what had happened. 3 ships. 3 times I should have died. 3 times I walked away. People started calling me Miss Unsinkable. I didn't like the nickname, but it stuck. There were newspaper interviews, people wanting to hear the stories. I mostly declined. What was there to say that wouldn't sound like bragging or complaining? I survived. Others didn't. That's all there was to it. I went back to sea eventually, worked on other ships during and after the war, wrote a memoir later in life, lived to be 83 years old, dying in 1971. But I never forgot the Britannic, or the Titanic, or even the Olympic collision. You don't forget the moments when everything changes. When the world tilts, literally and figuratively, and you have to decide who you're going to be in the crisis. Now, here's something most people don't know about the Britannic. She's still down there, 400 feet below the surface of the Key Channel, lying on her starboard side in remarkably good condition. Divers started exploring the wreck in the 1970s. Jacques Cousteau filmed her in 1976. Later expeditions mapped her, photographed her, even went inside. The wreck is in better shape than Titanic because she's in shallower, warmer water. The Mediterranean is kinder to shipwrecks than the North Atlantic. You can still see the red cross on her hull. The grand staircase is still there, though now home to fish instead of nurses. The operating theaters, the wards, all still recognizable. It's like a time capsule from 1916. But it's also a war grave. 30 people died when she went down, and the wreck is their memorial. Greece has protected the site. Diving is restricted and requires special permission, which is how it should be. Let's talk about what the Britannic tells us about safety and engineering. After Titanic sank, the world said, never again. They redesigned ships, added lifeboats, improved watertight compartments, created new regulations. The Britannic incorporated all those changes, and she still sank in under an hour. Does that mean the improvements were worthless? No. They saved over 1,000 lives, but it shows you can't engineer away every risk. War mines weren't part of the Titanic disaster scenario. Open portholes during preparation for port weren't considered. The possibility of propellers killing people who'd already made it to lifeboats wasn't anticipated. You fix the problems you know about, and then you discover new ones. Every disaster teaches lessons. The Titanic led to the Britannic's improvements. The Britannic led to new regulations about portholes and watertight doors. Those regulations led to safer ships that discovered different problems. It's a never-ending process, which is frustrating and humbling and necessary. There's another angle to this story that's worth considering. The Britannic was designed to be the height of luxury. Marble fireplaces, oak paneling, the finest everything. A floating palace for the wealthy. Instead, she became a hospital ship. Her grand dining room became a ward. Her staterooms became storage. Her purpose changed entirely due to circumstances beyond anyone's control. And you know what? She was probably more useful as a hospital ship than she ever would have been as a luxury liner. War is terrible. I'm not romanticizing it. But the Britannic service, however brief, was about saving lives. Bringing wounded men home, giving them a chance. That's better than ferrying rich people across the Atlantic. Sometimes the disaster is also the redemption. The ship that never was what she was meant to be became something more important. I think about that sometimes. Let me address something you might be wondering. How did I cope with being on 3 ship disasters? Didn't it traumatize me? Didn't I have nightmares? Of course I did. But here's the thing about trauma in 1916. You didn't talk about it. There was no therapy, no PTSD diagnosis, no support groups. You just got on with it. Millions of men were in the trenches experiencing horrors that made a ship sinking look minor. Millions of women were losing husbands, sons, brothers. Who was I to complain about being scared a few times? So I didn't. I worked. I stayed busy. I focused on helping others. Looking back now, with modern understanding of mental health, I probably should have taken more time. Probably should have talked to someone. Probably had unprocessed trauma I carried for years. But that wasn't how we did things then. You survived, and you moved forward, and you didn't dwell on it. Right or wrong, that's how it was. The Britannic story intersects with so many larger historical narratives. There's the Titanic disaster and how it changed maritime safety. There's World War I and the horrors of industrial warfare. There's the story of women in wartime, serving as nurses and support staff. There's the evolution of ship design and engineering. There's the question of fate and luck. Why did the Britannic hit that specific mine? Why were the portholes open that day? Why was I on all 3 Olympic-class ships? Some people see divine providence. Some see random chance. I've never been sure which I believe. What I do know is that small choices have big consequences. Someone decided to open those portholes. Someone laid that mine weeks earlier. Captain Bartlett decided to try for the beach. Each decision was reasonable at the time, and together they resulted in 30 deaths and the loss of the largest ship to sink in World War I. You can't predict everything. You can only do your best in the moment and live with the results. Here's a detail that haunts me still. After the Britannic sank and we were rescued, I found a life jacket in the debris. It belonged to one of the crew members who didn't make it. Inside the pocket was a letter he'd been writing to his mother. He talked about how safe the ship was, how unsinkable she was supposed to be, how his mother shouldn't worry because he was on the newest, safest vessel in the fleet. He never finished the letter, never got to mail it. His mother probably spent months wondering what happened to him, hoping he'd survived somehow. I kept that letter for a while, thinking I should find his family and deliver it. But I couldn't bring myself to do it. What comfort would it bring? What good would it do? Eventually, I threw it away. Maybe that was the wrong choice. Maybe I should have given his mother that one last piece of him. But I was young and didn't know what else to do. That's the thing about disasters. They're made up of thousands of small tragedies like that. Each person's story, each loss, each what if. The big numbers: 1,500 dead on Titanic, 30 on Britannic. They're just statistics. The real tragedy is in each individual life cut short. Let's talk about something that often gets overlooked. What happened after? The survivors of the Britannic were dispersed. Some went back to sea on other ships. Some went to other hospitals. Some went home and never spoke about it again. The wreck sat on the bottom of the Key Channel, largely forgotten. Greece didn't even know exactly where it was for decades. The families of the 30 dead received notifications. Some got bodies back for burial, some didn't. The inquiry filed its report. Changes were recommended. Some were implemented, some weren't, and World War I ground on for 2 more years. Millions more died. The Britannic became a footnote. That's the thing about history. The events we remember are often not the most important ones, just the most dramatic, or the ones with the best stories. The Britannic should be better known. It was the largest ship sunk in World War I. It demonstrated both the successes and limitations of safety improvements. It was part of the Olympic-class saga. But it isn't. And maybe that's okay. Maybe every disaster doesn't need to be remembered forever. Maybe it's enough that those of us who were there remember, and that we learned from it. I want to tell you about one more person from the Britannic. Her name was Elizabeth Furse, one of the nursing sisters. She was in her 40s, experienced, calm under pressure. When the mine hit, she was in one of the wards doing inventory. She could have left immediately, made for the lifeboats, saved herself. Instead, She went through every ward, every space, checking that no one was left behind. Keep in mind, this was a hospital ship. Even without patients, there were medical staff, cleaning crew, administrative personnel scattered throughout. Elizabeth made sure they all got out. By the time she made it to the boat deck, most of the lifeboats were gone. The ship was listing badly. Someone pulled her into one of the last boats as it was being lowered. She survived. And because of her, several other people survived who might not have. There were probably dozens of stories like that. People who did their jobs, helped others, stayed calm when everything was falling apart. We don't know most of their names. They didn't get medals or recognition. They just did what needed to be done. Those are the real heroes of disasters. Not the people who survive, but the people who make sure others survive. You know what's strange? For all the drama of the sinking, what I remember most clearly are the small moments. The taste of that tea in the lifeboat. So strong it was almost bitter, but it was hot, and it was comfort. The pattern of rust stains on the Britannic's hull as we rowed away, wondering who would have to paint over those if the ship had survived. A seagull that landed on our lifeboat for a moment, looked around at all of us confused humans, and flew away. Like it was saying, "What are you all doing out here?" The way the sunlight sparkled on the water. Beautiful and terrible at the same time. These tiny details that stick with you when the big things, the terror, the chaos, the disaster, become almost abstract. Memory is strange that way. If I could go back and talk to my younger self, the woman boarding the Britannic in November 1916, what would I say? I don't think I'd warn her. What good would it do? She wouldn't believe me, and even if she did, she couldn't prevent it. Maybe I'd tell her to pay more attention, to remember the details, to understand that she's living through something important, something that will matter to people a century later. Or maybe I'd tell her it's going to be okay. She'll survive. She'll have a long life. She'll see the world change in ways she can't imagine. But probably I wouldn't say anything. She was doing fine on her own. Sometimes you just have to live through things and trust that you'll figure it out. The Britannic story raises questions we still grapple with today. How do we balance safety and practicality? The ship was made safer after Titanic, but those improvements had limitations. Do we keep adding safety measures indefinitely? At what point does it become impossible to operate? How do we learn from disasters without being paralyzed by fear? Ships still sail, planes still fly, people still take risks, because the alternative is to stop living. How do we remember the dead without fetishizing tragedy? The Titanic has become entertainment, movies and exhibits and conspiracy theories. Is that honoring the victims or exploiting them? I don't have answers to these questions. I just know they matter. And I know the Britannic deserves to be part of the conversation, not forgotten in the Titanic's shadow. Here's something I realized years later. The three ships, Olympic, Titanic, Britannic, were sisters. Built from the same plans, by the same company, with the same purpose. The Olympic had a long, successful career. She served as a troop ship in World War I, earned the nickname Old Reliable, and was finally scrapped in 1935. The Titanic struck an iceberg and sank on her maiden voyage, the most famous maritime disaster in history. The Britannic served briefly as a hospital ship and was sunk by a mine after less than a year of service. 3 ships, 3 completely different fates. Why? Luck, timing, circumstances. The Olympic was lucky. The Titanic was unlucky. The Britannic was unlucky in a different way. There's no grand meaning to it. No cosmic justice or divine plan. Just the chaos of existence playing out in 3 different ways. That's oddly comforting, in its way. Let me tell you what the Britannic looked like as she went down, because I want you to really see it. The bow was underwater, completely submerged, waves lapping over the forward well deck. The ship was tilted to starboard at maybe 30 degrees, so the right side was much lower in the water than the left. The funnels, She had four, like Titanic, though one was a dummy, were still standing. Smoke was coming from some of them, which seemed absurd given the circumstances. The white paint with the green stripe and red crosses was gleaming in the sunlight. She was beautiful, even dying. Especially dying, maybe. The stern rose higher and higher. You could see the rudder, the propellers, massive bronze blades that could chew through anything. And then the angle got too steep, the stress too great. She slipped beneath the waves almost gracefully, if 50,000 tons of steel can do anything gracefully. A great surge of water, foam and waves, debris floating up from inside, and then, just the sea. Like she'd never been there at all. I've been asked if I was angry, at the Germans who laid the mine, at the captain for trying to beach her, at whoever opened those portholes. Honestly? No. Anger requires energy I didn't have. We were in the middle of a war. Ships sank every day. People died every day. Being angry about it wouldn't bring anyone back or prevent the next disaster. I was sad. I was tired. I was scared of going back to sea, though I did anyway. But anger? That was a luxury I couldn't afford. Maybe that's a coping mechanism. Maybe it's emotional avoidance. Modern psychology would probably have thoughts about that. But it got me through. That's all I can say. The Britannic had capacity for 3,300 people. When she sank, there were about 1,100 aboard. Think about that for a moment. If she'd been carrying a full load of wounded soldiers, if the mine had struck while she was bringing 2,000 injured men back to Britain, the death toll could have been catastrophic. Even with all the lifeboats, even with the training, getting 3,000 people off a sinking ship in 55 minutes would have been nearly impossible. Especially when many of them would have been on stretchers, unable to walk, some unconscious. It would have been a disaster that made Titanic look small. We were incredibly lucky that she was sailing empty, that we were in calm seas, that we were close to shore. Luck matters. It matters more than we like to admit. Here's a question I get asked sometimes. Would I do it again? Would I board the Britannic knowing what would happen? The philosophical answer is that I had no choice. The past is the past. I can't change it. But if you're asking whether, given the knowledge I had at the time, I'd make the same decisions? Yes, I would. The war needed nurses. The wounded needed help. The Britannic was a hospital ship doing important work. Someone had to serve on her. The fact that she sank doesn't change any of that. You can't live your life avoiding risks because something might go wrong. Ships sink, buildings collapse, cars crash. Life is dangerous. You do your best, take reasonable precautions, and accept that some things are beyond your control. Otherwise, you never do anything. Let me tell you about the last time I saw the Britannic. Not the ship itself, but the wreck. This was much later, in the 1970s, when I was an old woman. Jacques Cousteau's team was diving on her, and they invited me to come along. I didn't dive. I was too old for that. But I went on the support vessel and watched the footage they brought up. There she was. My ship. Lying on her side in the clear Mediterranean water. Recognizable. Still white, though covered in growth and corrosion. I could see the red cross on the hull. The portholes. The deck where I'd walked. All of it still there. Frozen in time. A monument to November 21st, 1916. It was strange. Sad and beautiful at the same time. I cried. I'm not ashamed to admit it. All those memories came flooding back. The mine strike, the listing deck, the lifeboats, the people who didn't make it. But also, the good times. The voyages before that day. The work we did. The lives we saved on other trips. The Britannic was more than her sinking. She was a hospital ship that served with honor, if briefly. She deserves to be remembered for that too. You want to know the strangest part of this whole story? I went back to sea after the Britannic. worked on ships for years, and I was never in another disaster. 3 ships in the 1910s, all within a few years. Then nothing. Decades of sailing without incident. Was I unlucky to be on 3 ships that had problems? Or lucky to survive all 3? I've never been sure. What I do know is that the experience changed me, made me more aware of risks, more appreciative of ordinary days, more conscious of how quickly things can change. I don't think I was a better person because of it, but I was a more careful one, more grateful. That's something, at least. The Britannic's wreck is protected now. The Greek government has designated it a maritime heritage site and war grave. You need special permission to dive it, and even then, you can't take anything from it. Which is good. It's not a treasure trove or an adventure site, it's a memorial. 30 people died there. Their bodies were never recovered. The wreck is their headstone. Some people think we should raise the Britannic, like they've talked about raising Titanic. Put her in a museum, restore her, let people see what she was like. I disagree. Let her rest. She's served enough. She's been disturbed enough. Some things should be left alone. I want to talk about one more thing before we finish. The nurses and crew of the Britannic. The ones who survived. We didn't stay in touch much. A few letters here and there. A reunion once or twice. But mostly we went our separate ways. I think it was too painful to keep reliving it. Every time you saw someone from that day, you remembered. The fear, the chaos, the people who didn't make it. Sometimes, the kindest thing you can do is let people move forward. We'd lived through something together. We'd survived. But that didn't mean we needed to be bound by it forever. Everyone processed it in their own way. Some talked about it constantly. Some never mentioned it again. Some wrote about it. Some painted it. Some had nightmares about it for the rest of their lives. There's no right way to survive trauma. You just do your best and hope it's enough. So what's the point of the Britannic story? It's not as dramatic as the Titanic's. Not as many people died. It doesn't have the same cultural impact. Most people have never heard of it. But maybe that's exactly why it matters. The Britannic represents all the forgotten disasters, all the tragedies that happened while the world was distracted by bigger events, all the people who died in ways that didn't make the history books. World War I killed millions. The Britannic's 30 casualties were a rounding error, but those 30 people mattered. They had families, dreams, futures that never happened. Every disaster, no matter how small in the grand scheme, is enormous to the people involved. The Britannic reminds us of that. If you take one thing from this story, let it be this. Safety improvements matter. The changes made after Titanic saved over 1,000 lives on the Britannic. They weren't perfect, but they worked. Learn from disasters. Don't just move on and forget. Figure out what went wrong and fix it. But also accept that you can't prevent everything. New risks emerge. Circumstances change. Things happen that no one anticipated. Do your best. Prepare for what you can. And when disaster strikes, keep calm, help others, and trust your training. That's all any of us can do. The Britannic lies there still, 400 feet down in the Key Channel. Fish swim through her wards. Coral grows on her hull. The sea is slowly reclaiming her. One day, far in the future, she'll disintegrate completely, become part of the seafloor. No trace left that she ever existed. But until then, she's a reminder, a monument, a lesson. The forgotten sister ship that served briefly, sank quickly, and saved most of her people. Not a bad legacy, when you think about it. I lived to be 83 years old, died peacefully in 1971, more than 50 years after the Britannic sank. I had a full life, traveled the world, wrote my memoirs, saw the ocean liners give way to airplanes, saw 2 world wars end, saw the world change in ways I never could have imagined as a young stewardess in 1916. But I never forgot that morning in the Key Channel, the mine strike, The listing ship, the lifeboats, the propellers, the wreck sliding beneath the waves. Some moments define you, whether you want them to or not. I was a nurse on the Britannic when she sank, among many other things in my life, but that's the one people remember. And you know what? That's okay. It's a story worth telling, a disaster worth remembering, a ship that deserves better than to be forgotten in her sister's shadow. So remember the Britannic. Remember her service, her sacrifice, and the people who sailed on her. Remember that disasters aren't just statistics, they're individuals, each with their own story. And remember that surviving is sometimes the hardest part, because you have to figure out what comes next. That's the story of HMHS Britannic, the forgotten sister ship that sank in 55 minutes with just 30 casualties, thanks to the lessons learned from Titanic. If you found this story interesting, let me know in the comments what other forgotten disasters you'd like to hear about. There are so many stories from history that deserve to be told. And if you learned something new today, consider subscribing. I've got plenty more historical deep dives coming your way. Thanks for listening. Take care of yourselves. And remember, sometimes the stories that didn't make the history books are the ones that matter most.